La vida puede ser una aventura, calurosa, rápida,
lenta o triste.
quizá a veces llena de altibajos.
Pero de acuerdo a los psiquiatras, cualquier parte de la vida puede etiquetarse como enfermedad mental.
¿De verdad? ¿Cómo qué?
Digamos que estás afectado después de una ruptura. Eso se podría etiquetar depresión,
¿Y si estás nervioso antes de hablar en público?
trastorno de ansiedad,
¿O eres muy hablador y superactivo?
maníaco.
Eso suena un poquito demencial.
Lo es.
Pero, ¿cuánto de esto ocurre realmente?
Preguntemos.
How many people do you know that have been diagnosed with a mental disorder?
Diagnosed with a mental, God, off the top of my head, maybe one person that I know who's been diagnosed with a mental disorder.
Probably just one.
So, yeah, maybe 2 or 3 people, maybe in the 3 or 4 range.
4 or 5, maybe 5.
6 people in the household.
6, 7.
10.
A dozen or so.
About 20.
How about 30?
Would definitely be in the hundreds for sure.
The total number of people that I know in my lifetime has been diagnosed with a mental disorder probably fall around the range of 100 to 150, and I'm 23 years old.
¡Wow! Pero, ¿de dónde salen todos estos trastornos?
Del Manual Diagnóstico y Estadístico de los trastornos mentales. Tiene 943 páginas y abarca todo, desde depresión y ansiedad hasta tartamudeo, adicción al tabaco, aracnofobia, pesadillas, problemas con las matemáticas y hasta trastorno infantil. Todos ellos reinterpretados y muchos etiquetados falsamente como enfermedad del cerebro.
Pero algunas personas sí tienen problemas serios en la vida.
Por supuesto, pero los psiquiatras los reducen a algo mal con tu cerebro.
A ver si lo entiendo. ¿Los psiquiatras tienen un libro con los problemas de la vida reinterpretados como trastornos mentales?
Así es.
¡Wow! Entonces debe estar apoyado en una base muy científica.
Eso es lo que creerías, pero no es así. Los psiquiatras en una de sus recientes convenciones lo admitieron. Escucha esto.
DSM is made up by committees of men who have political opinion, and women too, who have biases and political opinions. And so there isn't nearly as much science in DSM as there ought to be.
Like in the previous one, people had a meeting in the bathroom and they decided that something should be in there, and then they would go and propose it to the whole committee.
You have this kind of lumping together of several observations, and when you get enough of them in one tent, you got a diagnosis.
DSM system is not the real system of diagnosis.
A lot of the disorders that are in there haven't necessarily been rigorously validated.
It's just the best tool that we have available, but it is not perfect.
It's so useless that if you give me a patient and the DSM, I'll make at least 20 diagnoses on the same patient.
You have to take it with a grain of salt anyway.
It's actually getting more and more complicated.
We're left with diagnosing things on the basis of checklists and questionnaires, which leaves us sort of out of, as you said, the rest of medicine because we don't have a biological test.
Increíble.
La carencia de ciencia en el DSM es de hecho un secreto a voces. Esto es lo que algunos profesionales dicen sobre ello.
The DSM is a sham. It's been described as a house of cards. Why? Because the diagnoses are theoretical. They're not based on scientific measurements.
It's sort of a shaky level built on another shaky level, built on another shaky level.
It is flimsy and that it is easily collapsible under the scrutiny of critical thinking.
If you just pull one little fragment of the reasoning aside and question it thoroughly, you'll find it doesn't stand up, and then that means that the whole organism collapses because you've got some wrong premises in there somewhere. In fact, they're all over the place.
It is indeed a house of cards because it's predicated on not a solid structure. It is built to create an apparently legitimate edifice, which results in a diagnosis. But any serious inquiry will show it to be illegitimate.
Here, I tell you. With schizophrenia,
Entonces, si el DSM no se basa en la ciencia, ¿en qué se basa?
Bueno, empezó con un simple deseo de que la psiquiatría y la psicología se aceptaran en la corriente dominante de la medicina.
We psychologists have always desperately wanted to be accepted as a real science, as a true science. Now, what the early psychologists did was they looked around and they saw what other scientists were doing and they decided to emulate them.
Modern approaches to classifying psychiatric disorders dates from the 19th century.
Nearly all the clinical concepts we have today originate from that time. Probably the most important of all was a chap called Emil Kraepelin, who worked first of all in Heidelberg and then in Munich.
Nunca había oído hablar de él.
Emil Kraepelin se conoce como el padre de la clasificación psiquiátrica. Fue la primera persona que clasificó lo que pensó que eran enfermedades biológicas en el cerebro. Estaba la demencia precoz, que se llama ahora esquizofrenia, enfermedad maníaco-depresiva y psicosis paranoide. Todos esos conceptos todavía existen en el DSM hoy en día.
¿Eso es todo? ¿3 trastornos?
Sí, solo 3, pero el sistema Kraepelin pronto se hizo muy popular. Escucha esto.
Kraepelin's system caught on very quickly, not only in the German-speaking world, but also in the English-speaking world, in the United States and Britain. It caught on because up to that point, nobody had an agreed way of talking about patients.
So in the early 1950s, there was compiled Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Now, there are very few statistics in the book. Disorder is used essentially as a euphemism for illness. This is a book which catalogues mental illnesses for which no medical sign has ever been discovered.
Este panfleto primitivo tenía 130 páginas y enumeraba 112 trastornos mentales. Pequeño comparado con el DSM actual, pero mucho más grande que cualquier cosa prevista por Kraepelin.
¿Por qué tantos?
Porque al definir más y más de la vida como anormal, los psiquiatras podían poner sus manos en una cantidad enorme de dinero del gobierno.
¿Definir la vida? ¿Qué quieres decir?
Bueno, cosas como retener el aliento, morderse las uñas, chuparse el dedo, sonambulismo, eficacia pobre, hasta la homosexualidad.
Es ridículo. ¿Añadieron todos esos solo para tener gente a la que dar tratamiento?
Y más. Luego la segunda versión DSM-2 llegó en 1968 y se expandió a 178 trastornos. Una vez más, para hacerse con todavía más dinero del seguro del gobierno. Para hacer esto internacionalmente, el DSM-2 se escribió para seguir la línea de la Clasificación Internacional de la Enfermedad, el ICD, un libro usado en Europa y en todo el mundo, que aparte de los diagnósticos psiquiátricos, enumera enfermedades médicas reales.
Así que, esa es la forma en que los trastornos psiquiátricos fueron aceptados en la corriente dominante de la medicina.
Fue un inicio, pero el DSM-2 no era científico, pues estaba muy influenciado no por tests clínicos, sino por las teorías del psicólogo austriaco Sigmund Freud.
Entonces, debe de haber un montón de neurosis en ese libro, ¿verdad?
Sí, pero no había ningún conocimiento en absoluto de qué las causaba, y ni siquiera buscaron una causa.
Inclusion of a disorder in the classification does not require that there be knowledge about its etiology. So in other words, to make a diagnosis, you really don't need to bother with cause and effect. You don't need to know what causes the condition.
Espera un momento. Si el DSM no te dice qué causa los trastornos mentales, ¿cómo los descubren los psiquiatras en primer lugar?
La respuesta puede que te sorprenda.
New diseases are being invented all the time, and I want to emphasize the word invented, because when it comes to psychiatry, mental illnesses are not discovered, they're invented.
The way the system works in terms of diagnosis is that every few years a group of psychiatrists and psychologists sit around in a room and vote on new diagnoses.
¿Es esto ciencia? No puedo creerlo.
No te preocupes, no eres el único.
The diseases are voted on? What do you mean?
Did you say are they voted into existence?
Are voted?
As in created.
Oh, man.
I think that's kind of ridiculous.
It's crazy that you would vote. I definitely don't agree.
I don't agree with it at all.
Mental disorders should be based on scientific research.
I have been led to believe that it's all based on medicine and science.
So I'm kind of shocked to find that out.
Yo también.
Hay más, no solo se votan los trastornos mentales para incluirlos en el DSM, sino que de vez en cuando se vota para excluirlos. Por ejemplo, la homosexualidad, incluida en los DSMs 1 y 2 como enfermedad mental. Así es como el editor jefe del DSM-3, Robert Spitzer, lo explicaba.
I came up with a definition in 1973 that made it possible to argue that homosexuality was not a mental disorder.
On a vote, essentially, at a conference of the American Psychiatric Association, it was removed.
Now, did they discover that homosexuality was not a disease through scientific processes? No. It was included for political reasons, and it was removed for political reasons.
And the end result is a vote. It's a supposed democracy. So to call it science is a complete fabrication.
Así que el DSM es de hecho político, no científico.
Así es.
Pensaba que los psiquiatras querían ser vistos como médicos.
Así es. Por eso tuvieron que hacer que su manual tuviera un aspecto más científico.
Que no lo era. Así que, ¿qué hicieron entonces?
Bueno, decidieron que la siguiente edición del DSM iba a ser completamente diferente. Fue una decisión que cambiaría a la psiquiatría para siempre.
If you roll the clock forward to the 1970s in the United States, basically at that time psychiatry was in very poor shape for a number of reasons. First of all, it was held in very low regard by other members of the medical profession. So psychiatry was the sort of thing you did if you couldn't succeed in any other area of medicine.
And people such as Robert Spitzer in America made it very clear that the time had come essentially for psychiatrists, being doctors of medicine, to practice medicine. So if a psychiatrist was spending a lot of time dealing with people who were anxious, depressed, these dilemmas, these problems in living, now essentially had to be redefined. And they were redefined as medical conditions.
And their solution to this was to come up with a manual which defined psychiatric disorders more carefully. So, hence, we have DSM-3, which is the third edition, which is published in 1980.
Bajo Spitzer, los psiquiatras que editaban el DSM-3 descartaron la psicología freudiana y decretaron que desde entonces los diagnósticos psiquiátricos fueran puramente biológicos.
Así que al final se hicieron científicos.
No, en realidad para nada. De hecho, las disputas políticas sobre qué trastornos incluir y cuáles dejar fuera del DSM-3 fueron todavía más ridículas. Esto es lo que un psiquiatra tenía que decir sobre ello.
They would squeeze into a room which was about half the size of this one. It was much too small. And Bob would raise a provocative question, and people would shout out their opinions from all sides of the room. And whoever shouted loudest tended to be heard. My own impression is it was more like a tobacco auction than a sort of conference.
Y esto es lo que otro miembro del panel decisorio del DSM dijo.
The low level of intellectual effort was shocking. Diagnoses were developed by majority vote on the level we would use to choose a restaurant. You feel like Italian, I feel like Chinese, so let's go to a cafeteria. Then it's typed into the computer. It may reflect on our naivete, but it was our belief that there would be an attempt to look at things scientifically.
Parece como que tenían un manual de diagnóstico que parecía más científico, pero no tenía más ciencia en él que antes.
Entre tanto, el número de trastornos mentales en el DSM-3 se elevó hasta 259. Pero para vender la idea de que la psiquiatría era una auténtica ciencia médica, tenían que darle un sesgo con una teoría impresionante, que sonara científica.
But with DSM-3 from 1980 on, there was the progressive medicalisation of psychiatry. And the notion of chemical imbalance was invented and essentially took hold.
¡Wow! ¿Desequilibrio qué?
La teoría de desequilibrio químico se sugirió en 1965 para explicar cómo la depresión podría estar causada por un desequilibrio de elementos químicos en el cerebro.
Me gustaría oír eso.
Joseph Schildkraut teorizó que como las drogas psiquiátricas alteraban los niveles de esos elementos químicos, entonces la enfermedad mental tiene que estar causada por demasiados de estos o muy pocos.
¿No es eso al revés?
Sin duda lo es. Es como decir que como la aspirina quita un dolor de cabeza, que los dolores de cabeza los causa una deficiencia de aspirinas.
Ya veo lo que dices.
Pero fue lo bastante convincente como para darle a la psiquiatría y al DSM-3 el aura superficial de ciencia. Como Robert Spitzer dijo,
Psychiatry felt now, gee, we're more scientific, we're part of medicine.
Así que funcionó.
Sí, y desde entonces los psiquiatras y la industria farmacéutica han promocionado la teoría del desequilibrio químico implacablemente, tanto al campo médico como al público.
If you're one of the millions of people who live with uncontrollable worry, anxiety, and several of these symptoms for 6 months or more, you could be suffering from generalized anxiety disorder, and a chemical imbalance could be to blame.
Pristique is thought to work by affecting the levels of 2 chemicals in the brain.
It works to correct chemical imbalances in the brain, which may be related to symptoms of social anxiety disorder.
Cymbalta works on serotonin,
and norepinephrine.
Hundreds of thousands of patients have been prescribed Abilify. Ask your doctor.
Ask your doctor.
Talk to your doctor. Call your doctor.
Ask your doctor about Cymbalta.
Prestique is a key in helping to treat my depression. Ask your doctor about Prestique.
You come to my office, and I say to you, well, you describe what's going on in your life and your symptoms, and I say, well, it's clear to me that you've got a chemical imbalance, and we're going to write you a prescription for this. The truth of the matter is, there's no such thing as a chemical imbalance.
There's no test out there that they can depend on that tells you you have a chemical imbalance.
There's actually, in fact, dozens of studies showing that there isn't any measurable imbalance. So psychiatrists will explain to patients all the time, this is just like diabetes. In diabetes, you have low insulin, we have to readjust the insulin level. In depression, you have low serotonin, we have to readjust the serotonin level. But actually, we have already proven that there's nothing wrong with serotonin levels. It's completely a myth, disproven by our own evidence.
I had a psychiatrist. He said that, in his professional opinion, this child had ADHD, a chemical imbalance of the brain. And when he was questioned on the witness stand as an expert witness for the state, he was asked if they had done an MRI. He said no. He was questioned if they had done a CAT scan. He said no. He was asked if they had done any bodily fluid check known to medical science to prove that this child had a chemical imbalance of the brain. He says no. And when he was asked how he arrived at this ADHD diagnosis, a chemical imbalance of the brain, it came down to that he had counseled and observed this child for 2 hours, and half of the time was observing. How do you arrive at a diagnosis of a chemical imbalance of the brain by talking to a child and observing them for 2 hours? You don't, okay? It's pure guesswork.
Vaya, de verdad.
Míralo por ti mismo. Esto es lo que pasó cuando una persona con una cámara oculta fue a varios psiquiatras pidiéndoles que le hicieran test para enfermedades mentales.
Of any scientific test?
Not that I'm prepared to do this time.
So you getting that I have adjustment, what is it?
Adjustment disorder is mixed emotional thinking. It just means situational stress.
Right,
It's a formal diagnosis.
But I'm saying, just where do you get that from?
I take you at face value.
In terms of diagnosis, there's no way that I can x-ray it correctly or allow it.
So it's very hard to have anything to measure, because whatever's going wrong is happening in there, and we just can't go in and open up, somebody's skull and scoop something out to measure.
Right now, we don't have an X-ray or blood test. That doesn't mean that the diagnosis is not real.
The diagnosis is for insurance, and I'm not really trying to think too much in terms of diagnosis. I don't really see that as my main job here, to make a diagnosis, except to give something to the insurance that's reasonably accurate.
But we don't even really know what's going wrong in the book. So all the things that we found were found by accident.
Estoy atónito. El diagnóstico psiquiátrico se basa puramente en la opinión individual.
Sin importar lo que hagan, están equivocados. La BBC británica hizo incluso un programa sobre esto con 10 voluntarios, 5 considerados normales y 5 diagnosticados anteriormente como enfermos mentales. Fueron observados por 3 expertos a quienes se les pidió determinar quién era quién.
Vaya hombre.
Mira esto.
We think that it's likely that you've had a history of bipolar disorder. Is that correct?
You're wrong.
Okay.
We've come to the conclusion that at some time you've been diagnosed with a mood disorder.
You're wrong.
We were wondering whether at some point in your life maybe that you had suffered from a significant psychiatric problem of some kind or other.
No.
Not at all?
You are wrong.
All right, okay.
3 wrong diagnoses in a row. After a whole week of observation, the panel have identified just 2 out of 5 disorders.
Pues vaya con la ciencia.
Tú lo has dicho.
Okay, time in.
Paranoid. And I got a pair of compulsive disorders here.
Una pregunta. ¿Cómo pueden los psiquiatras decir de sí mismos que se basan en pruebas cuando no tienen ninguna?
Va todavía más lejos. No solo no tienen análisis que demuestren el trastorno mental con el que te etiquetan, ni siquiera pueden definir qué es un trastorno mental.
No.
Lo afirman incluso en el DSM. Mira esto.
Although this manual provides a classification of mental disorders, it must be admitted that no definition adequately specifies precise boundaries for the concept of mental disorder. There you go.
Increíble.
Pero los psiquiatras no habían terminado todavía. 14 años después del DSM-3 publicaron el DSM-4 y su editor en jefe ha sido más directo todavía sobre el término trastorno mental.
There is no definition of a mental disorder. It's bullshit. I mean, you just can't define it.
Así que, aunque admitieron que no podían definir lo que era un trastorno mental, un término que ellos usan en su propio manual, añadieron más trastornos.
Un montón más, 115 para ser exactos, para un total final de 374.
Eso es más de 3 veces la cifra de trastornos enumerada en el DSM-1.
Y eso solo en 40 años, y este libro pesa más de 2 kilos.
Es más grande que el listín de teléfonos.
Es el catálogo del comprador de enfermedades mentales, y con él 120 millones de personas en todo el mundo han sido diagnosticadas con enfermedades mentales.
¡Wow! Pero, ¿qué pasa con la Clasificación Internacional de Enfermedades? ¿Ha habido un aumento en los trastornos mentales ahí también?
Definitivamente, la sección de trastornos de conducta del ICD es prácticamente paralela al DSM. Lo que sea que pase en el DSM se refleja ahí también.
Vale, bueno. Hasta ahora he visto que no hay tests para identificar o confirmar un diagnóstico mental. No hay pruebas de la teoría del desequilibrio químico y ni siquiera saben lo que es un trastorno mental.
Y lo admiten, por lo menos entre sí. Este es un psiquiatra prominente hablando en una convención reciente de la APA.
You're sitting in your office, you see a depressed patient, you have no idea what's the matter with them. And I know all of you think you know the answer, but in terms of evidence, I don't know the answer and I don't think any of us really know.
Eso es increíble.
Y sin embargo te darán un diagnóstico muy rápido de todas formas. Este es otro psiquiatra influyente en el mismo congreso.
Jim Burley at the Maudsley Hospital did a study once on how long it took people to make up their mind about the diagnosis after they entered a room, and it was about, how many, David? It was 2 seconds? It was a couple of minutes. It was very...
¿Un par de minutos?
Sí. Por supuesto, incluso el entonces presidente electo de la Asociación Psiquiátrica Americana consta que dijo que el DSM es prácticamente una farsa.
Well, what does D stand for? I used to think it is diagnostic, but over the last few years realized it is more like a dartboard.
¿Diana de dardos? ¿Le dicen los psiquiatras a sus pacientes alguna de estas cosas?
No, de hecho, los psiquiatras actúan como que saben de lo que están hablando, mientras mantienen al público a oscuras.
I was sent to a psychiatrist who saw me again for maybe about 15 minutes, talked to me how I was doing at 7 years old, and I left with a prescription for Ritalin.
Probably within the first 15 minutes, he diagnosed me with having an anxiety disorder and put me on prescription medication.
The amount of time it took for the diagnosis was, I'd say, probably within 10 minutes I was diagnosed with anxiety, with depression, within 10 minutes of speaking to the psychiatrist, and I was put on those drugs immediately.
I received numerous different diagnoses from different doctors, and each one gave me a different drug.
I didn't have to undergo any tests. I didn't even have to sit there and I didn't have to ask any questions. It was just, that's what you've got, and this is the drug.
They really didn't talk to me. They were always talking and questioning my mother. It was all about getting the information from her and not from me.
It doesn't make sense to me. I researched it, I done my research, and I still can't fully understand how you can diagnose somebody with a short attention span.
There was never an explanation. Nobody really knew what it was or why it was caused or how did you get it, why did anybody have it, and what could anybody do about it. Just here, have some medicine and go away.
And I was put on, a horse's dose of an antidepressant called Effexor, 450 milligrams a day. They say if you're on 300, you're comatose.
It wasn't always Ritalin. It went from Ritalin to like Wellbutrin to Concerta
to Adderall. I remember asking these doctors, is there any other way we can do this? Is there any other therapy? Is there something we can do that won't make me feel so badly, that won't give me all these side effects and just horrible sensations through my body 24 hours a day? Is there something else I can do that might be not having to do with medications? Doctor said, no. See, what you have is very complex. You have a chemical imbalance in your brain that the only thing that can correct it is medication.
Wow, montones de diagnósticos, pero todo lo que parece recibir son medicinas.
Así es. Hoy un diagnóstico psiquiátrico significa realmente una droga psiquiátrica.
The whole question then becomes, okay, if we apply these labels, what next? And the what next tends to be, you get a prescription. And the prescription is for a drug that doesn't work very well and is toxic.
It's like a 1-2 punch. The number one of the 1-2 punch is the diagnostic manual. You've got all these disorders to choose from. The two is the treatment. So you've got the diagnostic manual in place, you've got a machinery in place, and then you've got this treatment that is there for the taking.
For everything you can think of that might seem to be odd behavior, the psychiatry field has a name for it. And then for every name of every diagnosis you have, there's going to be pharmacology behind it, and they have a pill for it.
Let me fan it out and pick a card, and there you go. Here's your label, and there's the drug that we'll give you to go along with that label.
98%, maybe 99% of people will get a diagnosis that justifies the use of a medication and also a follow-up appointment. Because remember, the business of medicine, the business of psychiatry, is seeing patients. And the psychiatrist that tells a patient they don't have a problem and there's no medicine for that problem doesn't have a very busy practice.
And that's sort of the purpose of the DSM-345, to provide a diagnosis that can be given a drug for that patient.
It's a quick buck. You don't need to do a physical exam. You put it in the chart, it's done. Prescribe away. Lifetime patient. That's what the DSM is for.
¿Están diciendo que el DSM solo está ahí para justificar el tratamiento con la droga?
Me temo que sí.
¡Wow! Así que si el tratamiento primario de la psiquiatría es drogar, se tiene que estar haciendo un montón de recetas ahí fuera.
Por supuesto. ¿Sabías que se escriben más de 600 millones de recetas para medicación psiquiátrica cada año?
Uf. ¿Pero qué pasa con los pacientes que no quieren drogas?
De hecho, el DSM tiene una categoría para eso también.
It says V15.81, non-compliance with treatment. Now this category can be used when the focus of clinical attention is non-compliance with an important aspect of treatment for a mental disorder or a general medical condition. If you refuse treatment, then you probably are mentally ill, ipso facto, by that fact alone.
Así que, si no haces lo que te dice un psiquiatra, ¿eso es un trastorno mental?
Así es.
Eso desde luego da miedo. ¿Y por qué no seguirían el tratamiento?
Porque las drogas que los psiquiatras recetan pueden causar algunas reacciones físicas muy fuertes y graves.
¿Quieres decir efectos secundarios?
Bueno, no exactamente.
Drugs really don't have side effects. Drugs only have effects, and we arbitrarily differentiate those effects of the drug that we like, and we say these are the effects of the drug. And those that we don't like, those are the side effects. It's akin to saying that a bomb that comes down on a building kills people and destroys the building, and the military general says, oh, killing of the people is really a side effect. No, you cannot separate out the destroying of the building and the killing of the people. And so these are not side effects, these are direct effects of the drug creating disaster.
People think antidepressants are going to make them happy, but it's not what they do. They numb them down, and then in themselves there's a withdrawal state from the antidepressants.
They just become like robots, some of them. They're not actually able to experience the whole variety and range of human feelings and emotions and work with them and express with them and share them with others. Because once you sort of put somebody on a heavy dose psychotic drug, I mean, you're just dehumanizing them.
These are very potent, very toxic medicines, cause on themselves diabetes, high cholesterol, cause what's called a metabolic syndrome, truncal obesity, premature hardening of the arteries.
They affect the heart and the lungs and the kidneys, and you never know exactly what to expect.
Most psychotropic drugs lead to massive weight gain. Some of them, like olanzapine, for example, can lead to weight gains of 25, 30, even 40 kilos in a year or two, and that is serious.
One of the side effects is it affects your sexual performance abilities.
In people who are on a lot of medication, they're just totally unable to detoxify through their liver, and then other functions of the body shut down one by one.
These drugs have on their labels may increase the risk of suicide and homicide in people who take them, just like a carton of cigarettes tests to say may be hazardous to your health.
And there's cases where many people who commit suicide or commit acts of violence are on these medications, which definitely has this type of side effect.
You look at the side effect profile is identical to what they're trying to treat, and in some cases worse, and especially in the instance of suicide, then you could see that it's an extremely treacherous area with very, very little actual science behind it.
¿Te lo puedes creer? Esas drogas son peligrosas.
Sí, y ha habido miles, quizá incluso millones de víctimas que vinieron a la psiquiatría por ayuda, pero se les dieron drogas que en última instancia les destruyeron. Gente como Candace, que tomaba Zoloft porque estaba nerviosa antes de los exámenes. Steven, que se suicidó 19 días después de que lo pusieran a tomar Prozac. Julie, que planeaba ir a la universidad y se colgó después de 7 días de tomar Zoloft. Matthew, de 13 años, cuando se colgó. Matt, un joven de 21 años que tomaba una mezcla de drogas psiquiátricas. Caitlin, que tomaba Zoloft y Trazadone. Beth, a la que se le dio Paxil para los problemas de sueño. Matthew, quien después de empezar con Lexapro. Charles, tomando Clozaril. Caitlin, con 12 años. Megan. Aaron.
Espera. Esto es demencial. ¿Me estás diciendo que toda esta gente que se suicidó había estado tomando drogas psiquiátricas?
Sí, un estimado de 42.000 muertes al año se han vinculado a drogas psiquiátricas, ya sea por homicidio o por suicidio.
Eso es más de 3.000 personas al mes. Tendrían que sacar esas drogas del mercado.
Claro que deberían, pero como esas drogas son con mucho el principal tratamiento que los psiquiatras les ofrecen a sus pacientes, ellos restan importancia a los riesgos, y sus pacientes pagan el precio.
When you get on the psychiatric drugs, you feel just like you don't really want to live anymore. Like, just depressed all the time, and you feel sad.
You don't feel like you're in your own skin. It almost feels like you just want to come out of your skin all the time.
Get really bad headaches, I'd start shaking. I wouldn't sleep very well, I'd have nightmares.
I had started shaking really bad, and it was like uncontrollable, you know? And it's like, I don't understand why I shake so much.
It brought on the symptoms that I was trying to escape from, very severe.
I'd go through spells where I'd just be completely just dead. There would not be me there. I'd just be standing there and there would be nothing.
I think we all have emotions, happy, sad, you know, situational emotions in life, and it didn't allow me to experience them.
Don't experience tears, you don't experience a lot of laughter. It just makes life real flatline.
I described to a friend of mine as like waking up in a manila folder and it's a cloudy day. Everything is boring, unmemorable, unspecial.
It changed me. It changed who I was. It changed the essence of my personality.
You know, it just started making me worse. And I got in such bad fights with my brother. I scratched his face up and, you know, stuff like that.
I started to experience suicidal ideations almost immediately. And I had never had any feeling like that before.
I remember when I was at home one day, I had taken my medication and I thought about killing myself, and I got really scared, so I ran to my brother and I told him, and he just held me and told me not to give up and to just keep trying.
And I actually thought that's maybe the one thing that I do have control over, that I could, you know, I could off myself, and I would be out of this roller coaster of an existence.
I have been raped. I have been coerced into doing things that I do not care to speak of. But just to put it in perspective, even having experienced that, the experiences in thoughts and loss of self that I had. Being put on Prozac was the worst violation I have ever experienced.
Estoy mudo de estupefacción. La gente ni siquiera sabe lo que estas drogas están haciendo porque confían en su psiquiatra.
No solo eso, estudios recientes han mostrado que sus drogas como los antidepresivos no curan trastornos mejor que una pastilla de azúcar, un placebo.
Así que, para recapitular, no solo el DSM proporciona la etiqueta que los psiquiatras te ponen, sino que justifica que te droguen con drogas poderosas que tienen un montón de efectos secundarios y que ni siquiera funcionan. Esto está fastidiado.
Definitivamente. Y luego todavía se aferran a la idea de que pueden corregir tu conducta indeseada con sustancias químicas. Naturalmente, la psiquiatría tiene un atractivo para la industria farmacéutica, pues ahora pueden comercializar y vender drogas para cada trastorno nombrado en el DSM.
Conozco esas campañas de marketing, están en todas partes.
Sí, pero si te das cuenta, también le hacen marketing al trastorno. Las empresas de fármacos anuncian los trastornos del DSM en publicaciones, televisión e internet, instándoles a hablar con su médico. Ponen a sus expertos pagados en programas de entrevistas para hablar de la última epidemia de enfermedad mental. Colocan artículos en los periódicos sobre estas e incluso contratan a psiquiatras para llevar a cabo estudios y escriben ponencias para darle a los trastornos el aire de ciencia.
Porque si la gente piensa que tiene el trastorno, pedirá la droga.
Exacto.
The pharmaceutical industry markets disorders. Because if you can market a disorder, then you've got something to sell your product to treat.
So people suddenly come to think of things they previously didn't regard as a disease state as a disease, go to the doctor, see the psychiatrist then prescribes the drug that the drug companies have received FDA approval for, and everyone is happy except for the patient.
They're all working together, the psychiatrists, the pharmaceuticals, and one feeds the other. So again, job security for the pharmaceuticals and also job security for the psychiatrists.
Y no son solo las empresas de fármacos las que fomentan estas enfermedades. Un psiquiatra, Joseph Biederman, creó y popularizó un trastorno llamado bipolar pediátrico. De hecho, dijo que podía empezar desde el momento en que el niño abre los ojos.
Bipolar, como en los cambios de estado de ánimo, para los niños.
Por desgracia, sí. En solo 9 años, el Dr. Biederman alimentó un auge que multiplicó por 40 la cifra de niños etiquetados como bipolares, a la mayoría de los cuales se les recetó poderosas drogas antipsicóticas ideadas solo para los enfermos mentales más serios.
No tenía ni idea.
El psiquiatra que editaba el DSM-4 admitió la influencia del DSM en la moda del bipolar infantil.
Well, we learned some very, very painful lessons in doing DSM-4, but inadvertently, I think we helped to trigger 3 false epidemics. One for the childhood diagnosis of bipolar disorder.
Demasiado tarde ahora, ¿no?
Para muchos niños, sí. Y como los psiquiatras afirman que trastornos mentales como el bipolar no se pueden curar, los psiquiatras y las empresas de fármacos han creado clientes de por vida.
Así que es una asociación natural.
Faltaría más. Las empresas de fármacos proporcionan montones de dinero de investigación para los psiquiatras que salen con más diagnósticos que tratar con drogas.
Drug companies have become increasingly dependent on mental illness diagnoses in order to maintain their profit margins. And psychiatrists and increasingly clinical psychologists are more than happy to manufacture mental illness in order to make that happen. Hence, the increase in size of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
The strategy is how many people we can diagnose with a particular label that would be broad enough to include a ton of people in it. And the mentality behind that is the sale of the pharmaceutical drug, which eventually becomes the treatment.
These drug companies are making a lot of money, and they're spilling that money and sending that money to people that will help support their cause. So it's not a surprise at all that they have infiltrated so many of the committees within the DSM and so much of our own medical education.
Espera un momento, ¿las empresas de fármacos se han infiltrado en los comités de psiquiatras que deciden qué trastorno poner en el siguiente DSM?
En el DSM-4, el 56% de los miembros del comité tenían vínculos financieros con las empresas farmacéuticas, la misma industria que iba a beneficiarse de las 115 enfermedades mentales diagnosticables que se aceptaron por votación.
Así que, claro, vemos más diagnósticos que se tratarán con drogas.
Y muchos más síntomas enumerados para cada trastorno.
The whole world is being made crazy, really. And we have these proliferation of categories which have become more and more encompassing, encroaching in ordinary everyday life.
There isn't a human being on the planet who doesn't have at some point, if not several points, in a day or a week, distress. It's part of being human. But to say that because you have this distress, that you now are diseased.
If you take a god man in India who wanders around with a shawl and meditates for 17 hours a day, drinks rainwater and engages in some kind of spiritual or religious discipline or practice where he might roll on the ground for 100 miles to a holy place, people there don't persecute those individuals. They accept them as people engaged in religious practices. But here, if you took those same individuals in India and you had them walk across a campus in America, they would immediately be arrested and put into a psychiatric facility because they're manifesting psychosis. This varies by culture.
What do we want to straitjacket everybody? Is everyone going to be the same? What about people that do have a little bit odd behavior? Is a little odd behavior bad or dangerous? It's just different.
You want this thing to cover, all manner of aberrant human behavior. So if you can cover every bit of it, then you're going to have the best chance possible to a billable unit of service.
Y por cierto, en caso de que no puedas ser incluido en cualquiera de sus categorías, hay una más que se te puede asignar.
Naturalmente.
This is number 301.9.
312.9. 292.9.
Bipolar disorder, not otherwise specified.
Gender identity disorder, not otherwise specified.
Disorder of infancy, childhood, or adolescence, not otherwise specified.
Not otherwise specified.
What the hell does that say? They don't know.
It's kind of like a catch-all.
It's the garbage can for the leftovers.
There's even a box for people that don't fit in the other boxes.
To me, it's insane.
This is like rubbish to me.
This is scary to me.
This is hackery, quackery, dockery.
Es una ciencia bastante pobre si tus categorías son tan flojas que necesitas una categoría de misceláneo para recoger los cabos sueltos.
Sí, como TDAH por lo demás no especificado, trastorno alimenticio por lo demás no especificado, trastornos del estado de ánimo por lo demás no especificados.
You can always use the NOS, the not otherwise specified diagnosis, and that's a billable service.
Not otherwise specified means that you're sort of at sea to some extent on the exact diagnosis, meaning it doesn't fit into any of the categories you've established.
Unspecified mental disorder. You see, that's considered a disorder. Having nothing wrong with you is now a disorder. That's what this says. Can you believe it?
No, no puedo creerlo. ¿Hay una categoría llamada trastorno mental no especificado? Como en no te lo describimos. ¿Eso es una enfermedad mental también?
La cosa se pone más demencial. De acuerdo al DSM, podrías ser diagnosticado con un trastorno mental que ni siquiera está en la lista.
Estás de broma.
Escucha esto.
These diagnostic criteria and the DSM-4 classification of mental disorders reflect a consensus of current formulations of evolving knowledge in our field. They do not encompass, however, all the conditions for which people may be treated or that may be appropriate topics for research efforts.
It's even in the language of the introduction, it's basically saying we're trying to have a diagnosis to cover all the bases of anything that somebody could come in complaining about, which is, again, entirely backwards from how medical diagnoses are come to.
Este DSM no está ni siquiera cerca de la medicina, ¿verdad?
Para nada. Es puro marketing.
God bless the insurance companies. And you get these multiple personalities you can call insurance companies.
Insurance billing, that's the big money right there.
Hay algo que todavía me fastidia. Si el tratamiento psiquiátrico es tan largo, tan caro e ineficaz...
Ya lo sé. ¿Quién estaría dispuesto a gastar esas cifras exorbitantes de dinero para tratamiento psiquiátrico que se alarga durante años y a menudo toda una vida mientras proporciona resultados pésimos?
Exactamente. quién paga por todo esto?
Principalmente el gobierno y las aseguradoras privadas de salud.
Claro, las aseguradoras.
De hecho, el grupo de presión psicofarmacéutico ha sido muy eficaz para que se pasaran leyes que obligan a las empresas aseguradoras a proporcionar seguro de salud mental igual al seguro médico regular.
A eso se le llama paridad de salud mental, ¿verdad?
Así es, pero económicamente esto ha sido una catástrofe.
So there's nobody who walks into a psychiatrist's office that isn't going to go out with a label. He's got 374 choices or so based on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual list of symptoms. So he's got to fit you into one of those categories in order to get paid.
The DSM really should be called, how to bill the insurance companies, how to get money from the insurance companies. It's a list of codes, and there's a number for everything, and that number goes on an insurance form, and then you get payment for it.
The DSM is completely built into the system now because you can't get reimbursed by an insurance company unless there's a DSM diagnosis.
You know, a kid wets the bed, you can bill on that. They're going to have one called a skin picking disorder. You pick your skin, you can diagnose and bill on that. You know, you can always find a diagnosis and you'll always be able to bill.
A psychiatrist or a psychologist can go through their book now and find a diagnosis code for just about anything. Everybody would fall into something that they could put a diagnosis on and fraud insurance companies.
Vaya chanchullo.
Así es, cada año la industria psiquiátrica usa el DSM para amasar $100.000 millones del gobierno de Estados Unidos y de aseguradoras privadas. Y eso es solo un país.
Estoy empezando a darme cuenta de lo mucho que el DSM ha elevado los costes generales del tratamiento médico.
Lo sé. El promedio de la facturación de seguros de los psiquiatras es el doble de la del tratamiento médico general.
Y eso eleva lo que yo tengo que pagar para el seguro.
Así es, y eso desperdicia impuestos también. El programa de seguros de salud mental del estado de Texas estaba casi en la bancarrota debido a una clase de droga psiquiátrica muy cara que se recetaba normalmente para el trastorno bipolar.
Vaya, eso es un montón de drogas.
Sin duda lo es. Y encima de eso, como los diagnósticos del DSM son tan arbitrarios, otro problema enorme y costoso es el fraude de seguros. Se ha pillado a los hospitales psiquiátricos privados haciéndose pasar por clínicas para dejar de fumar o para perder peso, para conseguir gente que sea admitida. Pagando a los reclutadores $3.000 por cabeza para conducir a los pacientes del seguro a través de sus puertas. Y a retener a los pacientes dentro tanto tiempo como sea posible hasta que se les acaba el seguro.
¿Y todo esto es por el dinero del seguro?
Así es. Y una vez que los pacientes están inscritos, se puede sacar cualquier diagnóstico del DSM para justificar el tratamiento. Mira el metraje de esta cámara oculta de alguien que se hizo pasar como trabajador de un hospital psiquiátrico.
What do you think? You think he's I thought I've interacted with him a lot. I thought he's always appropriate. He's always.
But under behavior, what's some good words in here? He's not negative. He's sort of intrusive a little bit.
He's not really.
He doesn't push limits anymore.
He's really acting intrusive.
He acts sort of anxious. Focus on the negative.
And why should we focus on the negative?
Because that's how they get paid. I mean, this is what they told me. I mean, you write what you want to write. I know I got to write for you. So I know what I have to write. You know what I mean? So that's why
why do you have to write it?
So this place can get paid. It's a business thing. It's not like I'm lying, but I always pull the negative out. You're supposed to. They tell you to. What? The negative? Pull the negative out. You pull it out of them.
Eso no puede ser ético.
No lo es. Y eso es solo el inicio del fraude. A los que proporcionan servicios psiquiátricos se les ha pillado facturando a las aseguradoras por tenerles escuchando música, viendo la tele o jugando al bingo, cobrando por llamadas para despertar, entradas de cine o viajes al extranjero. O por afirmar que trataban a la gente que estaba en la cárcel en coma o incluso muerta.
No.
Algunos psiquiatras han facturado incluso por tener sexo con sus pacientes y llamarlo terapia.
Eso es repugnante.
Como un director de fraude de seguros dijo, el alcance del fraude solo está limitado por la imaginación.
No tenía ni idea.
No hay muchos que la tengan. Las estafas en la salud mental timan a las aseguradoras y a los contribuyentes 5.000 millones de dólares cada año solo en Estados Unidos.
Deberían arrestar a esos criminales, encerrarlos y tirar la llave.
It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the third edition.
He mencionado que la psiquiatría ha tenido también mucho éxito usando el DSM para infiltrar nuestro sistema de justicia.
¿Los tribunales también?
Sí.
The clinical diagnosis of a DSM-4 mental disorder is not sufficient to establish the existence for legal purposes of a mental disorder. That's a very interesting point. Basically, what the authors are saying here is that the material in the DSM has no utility in the courtroom in deciding guilt or innocence. It should not be used in courtrooms as part of the legal process.
Espera un momento. ¿No declaraba el DSM que no puede usarse para establecer la existencia de un trastorno mental en un tribunal de justicia?
Precisamente. Y sin embargo, se usa todo el tiempo.
Sí, es como la alegación de demencia.
Y las batallas por la custodia, compromisos civiles, tribunal sucesorio.
He leído de psiquiatras ante los tribunales en bandos opuestos, cada uno usando el DSM para reforzar su caso, y cada uno de ellos fue aceptado por el tribunal como testigo experto.
As far as I could see, for psychosis or delusions. Because he's suffering from narcissistic personality disorder and a delusional disorder, grandiose.
Una contradicción completa. No siempre ha sido así.
In the beginning of the 20th century, a psychiatrist in a courtroom would be laughed out of the courtroom by and large. Today, it's commonly accepted testimony as long as it's in accord with the DSM.
The danger in using the DSM in a court setting is that you're using a vocabulary that the judge or the jury doesn't fully understand. They are, by concocting these psychobabble words, it makes it seem like there's something there that may not be there.
The courts have allowed all this junk science to come into the courts, and they've made case law on it. And once the case law is made, we're stuck with it until it gets overridden.
They come in with tests, they come in with their diagnostic categories from the DSM, and they say, we've done tests, we've determined that this person has this numbered malady, and therefore they do. And there's almost no way to pry a judge out of accepting that.
When a psychiatrist makes a diagnosis in court, is that the person is sent to a mental institution, deprived of liberty, and we have no idea whether he's guilty or not.
Basándose en los diagnósticos del DSM, se interna a alguien en un psiquiátrico cada 40 segundos.
Esto está absolutamente fatal.
Y cualquiera, en cualquier momento, puede perderlo todo debido a la opinión de un psiquiatra. Escucha esto.
I went to a stop smoking course at Vanderbilt. And the doctor, the lady that ran the program said that she goes, we need to get you on a stop smoking medication. So she prescribed me Zyban. Well, after the fact, I find out that Zyban is nothing but this really powerful antidepressant called Wellbutrin. Yeah, I stopped smoking, but I had no idea the hell's gates were being opened when I started taking Zyban. I had been clean and sober for 18 years. Just never considered that. But something about that, I started experiencing the craving to drink again, and my life fell apart. Divorce, relapse. So then a sibling of mine got wind of my relapse, wanted to gain control of my pocketbook and my life, and found the dirtiest lawyer in town who knew, one of the dirty psychiatrists, and bought and paid for an evaluation, had a hearing in a court before I was ever served notice. And the next thing I know, every right that a human being can possibly have was taken from me. And you have less rights as a conserved person than you do as a criminal. I mean, you are stripped of every right. You can't enter into a contract. You cannot marry. You cannot sue. You cannot even fight the legal system that has involuntarily put you in this. And it was all based on the psychiatrist's diagnosis, who never evaluated me.
Eso es increíble. Estaba intentando dejar de fumar, pero en vez de eso recibió un diagnóstico psiquiátrico y le arrebataron sus derechos.
Le han quitado todo su dinero también, por no mencionar que estuvo encarcelado en una institución psiquiátrica. Pero si piensas que lo que los psiquiatras le hacen a los individuos en nuestro sistema judicial es malo, espera cuando veas lo que le hacen a las familias.
Children are taken away from parents every day in these juvenile courts because a person with a PhD or an MD after their name comes in and says, I've shown ink blots to a person, and they may be a risk to a child. Just in my little state of Massachusetts here, there are 11,000 children in captivity taken away from families at any one moment. And almost all of those children are being drugged. And our own commissioner of children and families testified under oath that they drug 88% of the children that they take out of the families.
88% drogados, eso es prácticamente algo que se da por descontado.
Y eso es solo la punta del iceberg. Por todo el mundo, los psiquiatras usan los tribunales en una serie de formas para arrebatarle los derechos a la gente y destruir familias. Solo mira.
Psychiatry has affected my family through the family law court rulings. The family law court has a court-appointed child psychiatrist who, it appears, determines the future of the child.
It's just like a business in the court system that they forced you to undergo all of these psychological evaluations, and you have to pay thousands of dollars, but at the end of the day, it has been supported by no evidence, nothing.
They'd said to me, Deb, you have a choice. Either you bring your son to get medicated, or we'll take your child away from you and put him in a home that they'll medicate your child. And then good luck. Basically, they were saying, good luck, Deb, to try and get your son back, but you'll get him back medicated anyways.
And they put her in hospital, and that's when the psychotropic drugging started with Becky. And at that stage, I had no say over it.
They refused to let her go. They would not let my daughter go unless she take medication.
This was again a recommendation from the psychiatrist that once my son was radically ripped from his home and literally kidnapped and put in a new home with a perpetrator of domestic violence and of sexual assault, and is where he now lives, this psychiatrist said that he was never to have any counselling and never to see anybody.
To have your family just disrupted like that, ripped out from under you, really, your whole life, just gone like that. And then you have to fight every day to get him back. It was very devastating.
In some ways, it's worse than a death because it's unresolved and you know what the truth is. And you feel like giving up and not fighting back for that custody of that child, but you can't. There's just no justice.
Esto es terrible. ¿Están destrozando familias basándose en diagnósticos arbitrarios en los tribunales?
Exactamente.
So it's unfortunate that the courts have bought into the DSM. It's unfortunate that the whole psychiatric profession is wedded to the DSM. It's unfortunate that the psychiatric profession is in bed with the drug industry, and it's unfortunate that drugs that don't work are the common prescribed drugs for all manner of conditions in children and in adults. It's the wrong way to go.
Oh, no a ellos también.
Por desgracia, sí. Los niños son ahora un objetivo de mercado enorme para la psiquiatría. El número de trastornos de la infancia incluidos en el DSM ha ascendido como un cohete desde 3 trastornos en 1952 hasta 44 hoy en día.
Eso es 15 veces más.
Y aún así, el DSM básicamente admite que no debería diagnosticar a los niños.
In early childhood, it may be difficult to distinguish symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder from age-appropriate behaviors in active children, such as running around or being noisy. We basically don't know the diagnosis from normal childhood. That's what that's saying.
Trastorno del déficit de atención e hiperactividad. Así es como los psiquiatras llaman a los niños que no se sientan quietos en clase, se agitan, corren o trepan mucho. Básicamente conducta infantil, ¿verdad?
Así es, y 20 millones de niños en todo el mundo han sido etiquetados con algún trastorno mental.
Así que, en vez de dejar que los niños sean niños,
los psiquiatras les dicen ahora a los padres que sus hijos están enfermos mentalmente y que necesitan drogas psiquiátricas.
It used to be that you were on the playground, you'd had the weird kid, you had the shy kid, you had the goof off, you had the hyper kid. You can't have that anymore. Now it's all medical diagnoses.
For them to come up with new diseases and new issues and diagnosis in their book, it doesn't correct bad behavior, okay? They can give children all the pills they want. It still doesn't correct bad behavior.
The thinking still is, you must fit into this mold. And if you don't fit into this mold, there's something wrong with you. And if you're not the person who designs the mold, too bad for you.
A child is labeled and then they're brought to professionals who are trained a very particular way. They're all being trained that if the child fits into this category, then we should consider putting them on Ritalin because that's what they do. That is the protocol.
The way the Ritalin will be marketed to the parents is that they will say, this is a drug to calm your child down. What they won't say is that methylphenidate is a form of speed. It's a form of amphetamine, and what we're actually doing is overdosing your child on speed.
It's a stimulant, so naturally it's going to increase heart rate, increase blood pressure, and you put a kid out on a football field on a hot summer day, and his risk of having a cardiac event of some sort has just gone up.
¿Sabes? He oído que los estimulantes que se les dan a los niños con problemas de atención son químicamente muy similares a la cocaína.
Sí, y tienen un potencial tan elevado de que abusen de ellos que están incluidos por el gobierno de Estados Unidos en la misma categoría que la morfina, el opio y la metanfetamina.
Así que, ¿a quién van a drogar los psiquiatras a continuación? ¿A los bebés?
Exactamente. Usan lo que llaman Clasificación de Diagnóstico de 0 a 3, o DC-03. Es como un mini DSM para bebés y niños que empiezan a caminar. Escucha esto.
We already targeted our school children with ADHD and bipolar. That's already done. That was done 20 years ago. And we're moving younger with DC-03 to the 0 to 3 age group where they're trying to make popular the idea that it's okay to medicate 0 to 3-year-olds.
The idea of a program to determine whether a child from birth to the age of 3 has a mental illness is so preposterous, so absolutely insane, that it's simply an additional part of the insanity that is now extant throughout this country. I cannot think of a program that is more insane than that.
How are they going to diagnose a 1-year-old or an infant with a psychological disorder? How do they know?
You almost have to ask ourselves, if our societies become sick, what are we doing to our fetuses, our infants, our children, that would make us need to have psychiatric medications?
We're rolling dice with life. We're rolling dice with our children who can't even discuss it with anybody. They have no control. They are the helpless victims. And the ones who are supposed to protect them and care aren't armed with the facts.
Si los padres supieran todo esto, estarían furiosos.
Ya lo creo, pero cuidado, porque el DSM dice también que podrías contagiarte de la enfermedad psiquiátrica de tus niños.
No puedes decir eso en serio.
Está en el DSM.
We're going to talk about some of the proposed changes that are suggested for DSM-5.
He oído que el DSM-5 es incluso más demencial que el DSM-4.
Así es.
You've got 374 named diagnoses in DSM. Well, guess what? There's going to be more in DSM-5.
Why do we all of a sudden need a fifth DSM-5? Psychiatry wanted to broaden the horizons of mental health problems, of disorders. They wanted to stretch the disorders so it would encompass more. And to do that, they're going to add more diagnoses.
We need more diagnoses like we need a hole in the head, really. They're not serving a purpose for mankind, all these diagnoses. They're almost laughable, some of the diagnoses.
¿Irrisorios? ¿De verdad?
Bueno, están hablando del trastorno de acumulación si no te deshaces de suficientes cosas.
Persistent difficulty discarding or parting with personal possessions.
Trastorno alimentario compulsivo si comes demasiado a menudo.
Recurrent episodes of binge eating.
Oh, y está el trastorno de rascado cutáneo.
So it's recurrent skin picking resulting in skin lesions.
¿Son esos trastornos mentales?
Y para los niños hay un nuevo trastorno que recogerá un número enorme de niños cuyos berrinches no califican todavía como para llamarlos bipolar.
They've created temperate dysregulation disorder to seem a little bit more mild of the condition and include a lot of the younger population in terms of that diagnosis. And what it essentially does, it just broadens bipolar disorder into a whole other new category. And where they don't fit into bipolar, now they can fit into this other diagnosing criteria.
Así que la red se está haciendo cada vez más amplia.
Más de lo que crees, están considerando incluso añadir una etiqueta por emplear demasiado tiempo en el ordenador.
Internet addiction diagnosis. It's another example of, just taking something going on in the popular culture that's, pretty widespread, and then finding a way to pathologize it.
I know people personally that spend 12, 13, 14 hours a day on the internet or social networking groups like Facebook. So there is something going on there. But is it a condition that we need to then label and drug? Absolutely not.
Eso es irrisorio.
Sí, hasta que consideras que en China el gobierno ya ha establecido clínicas psiquiátricas que tratan a los adolescentes por, entre comillas, uso problemático del ordenador, a veces usando el choque eléctrico para curarles.
¡No!
Y si crees que eso es malo, hay una inclusión más en el siguiente DSM que es verdaderamente espeluznante.
¿Se pone peor?
Este toma el diagnóstico de la enfermedad mental un paso más allá, síndrome de riesgo de psicosis, conocido más recientemente por el enrevesado título de síndrome de síntomas psicóticos atenuados.
Eso es un trabalenguas. Pero, ¿qué significa eso?
A really scary thing that's coming on the horizon is to come up with a whole bunch of diagnoses in there that are looking at people who currently are mentally well-adjusted but have a risk of developing a mental illness in the future.
They're still thinking they can define well before the symptoms develop the risk of a person developing a major mental disorder without any biochemical, biological or genetic test or any physical test whatsoever.
They don't know the cause of a mental illness. They can't treat it, they can't cure it. So how can they launch a preventative campaign for mental illness? It just logically, it falters.
Espera un momento. ¿Creen los psiquiatras realmente que pueden predecir un trastorno en algún momento en el futuro?
Escuchemos lo que dicen.
How can psychiatrists know if you're going to have a mental disorder in the future?
Again, that we don't know categorically who will develop psychiatric illness in the future.
It's really hard to say, actually. I don't know if you could 100% predict for anybody.
You can't forecast if one will develop a psychiatric disorder.
Maybe not, or maybe yes.
It's hard to predict.
It's hard to predict. There's no way to predict that.
Well, I don't think that nobody knows that.
There's no way to tell.
Nobody knows?
I don't think anyone can know what's going to happen in the future.
Obviamente no tienen ni idea.
Sí, pero a pesar de esto ya están proponiendo hacerles test a los niños para enfermedades mentales futuras.
De forma que las puedan tratar ahora.
Claro.
I would hate to see us go into the type of society where people are
locked up for what they may do in the future rather than what they actually have done.
Identifying people who are pre-psychotic would be a huge industry.
Wow, eso es verdaderamente aterrador.
Y lo que es una locura es que los psiquiatras siguen adelante con el DSM-5 cuando algunos de sus más influyentes miembros admiten abiertamente que no sirve absolutamente para nada.
Any comment on DSM-5? It's of no use to us in the rest of the world.
Incluso el psiquiatra encargado del Instituto Nacional de Salud Mental de Estados Unidos es menos que entusiasta al respecto.
I don't do DSM, I'm not involved. So, and that maybe tells you more than anything. NIMH is not involved with DSM.
Así que el hombre en la cima de la mayor organización psiquiátrica mundial no quiere saber nada del DSM.
Eso es lo que parece. Es un fraude total.
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is effectively the story that is being wrapped up in statistics and numbers and categories that when medicine tosses, doesn't fit any of our categories over to psychiatry, psychiatry says we'll find a category, and if we don't, DSM-5 or 6 or 7 will.
I think in 2016 we'll be looking at DSM-6 and there will be 1,425 diagnoses and I'll have 900 of them.
Eso es una locura.
Sí, pero todo está diseñado para encajar a más y más personas bajo la cobertura del diagnóstico de la psiquiatría.
De forma que puedan hacer caja incluso con más conducta normal.
Ahí lo tienes.
Entonces, si el DSM es tan completamente inútil, ¿por qué los psiquiatras...? Oh, ya entiendo. Se trata solo de dinero, ¿no?
Con la psiquiatría se trata siempre de dinero. Y todo empieza con el DSM. Como Robert Spitzer dijo,
The American Psychiatric Association found out it could make a lot of money by selling it. They've made a tremendous amount of money.
Every time they revise the DSM system, the American Psychiatric Association makes a hell of a lot of money.
¿Una tremenda cantidad de dinero? ¿De qué cantidades estamos hablando?
$6.500.000 en ventas al año.
¡Uf!
Pero no es solo la venta del DSM lo que amasa los beneficios. Los psiquiatras y las empresas farmacéuticas hacen dinero cada vez que lo usan para diagnosticar a alguien.
You create disorders so that you can treat it with a drug. It's the ultimate money-making machine.
How many people can we drug? How many labels can we put out there? How many people can we herd into these labels and feed them a drug so we can get richer, make more money?
There's an inherent conflict of interest, and that conflict of interest is driven by the desire to make money. More money, more money, more money than one should expect.
Huge money in the psychopharm business. If you really did the research on these diagnoses, you'd see that 90% of them or more don't exist. They're not valid. Then that's all of a sudden, all that reimbursement from the insurance companies disappears.
So we have to cut the money cord, as well as cutting the DSM cord if we're ever going to really succeed stopping this juggernaut from continuing.
Once again, it's follow the money. And you'll get your answer every time.
Esto me ha abierto bien los ojos. Vamos a ver. No hay análisis de laboratorio para el así llamado trastorno mental, que los psiquiatras ni siquiera pueden describir en su propio manual. La teoría del desequilibrio químico es totalmente falaz, y aún así las drogas psiquiátricas que supuestamente equilibran las sustancias químicas de tu cerebro se recetan a la gente de todas las edades.
Sí, nada menos que $84.000 millones al año, añadiendo un aumento general de $10.000 millones por primas del seguro de salud solo en Estados Unidos.
Y lo estamos pagando todos a través de los impuestos del gobierno y facturas del seguro cada vez más altas.
Así es, toda la industria psiquiátrica usa el DSM para embolsarse $330.000 millones al año.
Eso es casi $1/3 de $1 billón.
Y sigue aumentando. Está descontrolado.
Well, the whole system is now a runaway train, but the DSM is the locomotive. And if you took the locomotive off, eventually the train would stop, because there'd be nothing more pulling it.
We're losing the concept of health. Everybody is sick and everybody's got a condition and everybody needs drugs.
You're going to end up with a whole society that's going to basically have to be led around by the hand. But who's going to lead them around? Because they're drugging so many of them.
In psychiatry, you know in your heart of hearts that you're not really diagnosing. You know in your heart of hearts that you can't really treat what you think might be wrong. And you also know that most of what you're dealing with in the DSM is unprovable and unreliable, not a predictable indicator. So what do you have then?
Buena pregunta. Supongo que no tienen nada.
Y se le está haciendo daño a la gente.
Sí.
You're very lucky to go through psychiatry and survive. It really is as simple as that.
Only when enough people rip the veneer away and show that it's just nothing more than a Hollywood set is it ever going to fall down.
It would be good if all the medical professionals who are really practicing medicine and really trying to help people and based on scientific fact and what they can best do to improve the lives of others, if they would recognize, just be able to look at this fact. It's hard to look at it, but look at this fact and be ethical and be honest and clean up the profession by getting rid of this fraudulent part of it. Psychiatry.
Yo no lo habría dicho mejor. Es así de obvio. Tenemos que deshacernos del DSM. Es terrible para la sociedad.
Lo sé, a pesar de su base increíblemente inestable, el Manual Diagnóstico y Estadístico ha impactado literalmente cada parte de nuestro mundo.
Nuestras escuelas, nuestros gobiernos...
Nuestros sistemas judiciales.
¿Y qué hay de los medios de comunicación y el ejército?
Esos también.
Básicamente toda nuestra sociedad.
Y todo ello sin ni una sola persona curada.
El DSM es realmente más que solo un castillo de naipes.
El Manual de Diagnóstico y Estadístico es el timo psiquiátrico más mortal.